Okay, testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2.
Yeah, you're great. I'm also great, audio-wise.
Okay, good.
How you
We
doing?
have a squared image. Okay, it looks good. All
Yeah,
right.
yeah. How you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Great.
Looking forward to our conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. I'm going to start this episode off with a big thanks to the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver happening November 2nd to the 4th. You've probably noticed they've sponsored a few episodes over the last couple months, and yeah, that's very exciting. The guest today, Chris Bache, is one of the presenters at the conference, and I will be one of the attendees. So if you want to come check me out or check out the conference in general, or come check out Chris at that conference, follow the link contained in the description to this episode, jump over there. If you buy a ticket, then I get a little bit of commission from that, which goes towards my costs to fly out to Vancouver to attend this. So it's, and you get to go to a great conference. Yes, win-win. Okay. Today's guest is Christopher M. Bache. Bache is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Youngstown State University, where he taught for 33 years. He is also adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies and a fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. An award-winning teacher and international speaker, Chris's work explores the philosophical implications of non-ordinary states of consciousness, especially psychedelic states. He has written 3 books translated into 6 languages. Life Cycles, a study of reincarnation in light of contemporary consciousness research, Dark Night, Early Dawn, a pioneering work into psychedelic philosophy and collective consciousness, and The Living Classroom, an exploration of teaching and collective fields of consciousness. He has a new book being released from Inner Traditions in 2019, Diamonds from Heaven, a 20-year journey into the mind of the universe. So let me just give you a little bit more detail as to Christopher and what he's been up to. At some point, about 40 years ago, he decided it would be a good idea for him to take high doses of LSD regularly with the intention, I guess, to map consciousness as a metaphysical philosopher, and then proceeded to do so 76 times over the course of 20 years. 20 years after his last journey in that specific structure, he is about to release his book, Diamonds from Heaven, and he is on the show today to talk about basically what drove him to do this, what it was like, and what did he learn? And furthermore, not just what did he learn about the nature of consciousness and the psychedelic experience, but what did he learn about what can we do as human beings to make sense of experiences that are as massive as the ones you're going to hear him describe in this episode. We also had a great post-credits talk that, with his permission, I am going to be releasing as well, exclusively to the patrons at first, but after a few weeks, you will be able to get access to it on YouTube. So if you are not already subscribed to YouTube, please head over there. Do so, hit the little bell so that you get notifications, because these sort of extra episodes, the post-credit sequence, only get notified to patrons, and then once they're public, they only get notified basically out through those who are subscribed on my YouTube channel. So head over there and do that if you're not already watching this on YouTube. And if you want to become a patron, that would be amazing, because it is thanks to my patrons on Patreon that I am able to give my time into building this podcast and the larger domain of my work for you, the psychedelic culture. Big thanks to the patrons whose names are listed in the upper corner of this episode on YouTube, and to Tempoic Massage, and Lola for the excellent and very generous PayPal donations. Okay, got a little bit of noise happening in my environment now, so I'm going to end this quick. If you want to support the show by becoming a patron or by leaving a donation, the links to do so are contained in the description to this episode on YouTube at jameswjesso.com and whatever podcatcher you are listening to it. Enjoy this episode with Christopher Bache on Adventures Through the Mind. Just because of the context of my work and my travel, I didn't get a chance to really look into what you do until yesterday. Other than, Stephen's, what's the word I'm looking for? Shining recommendation definitely put you on the map. And then I was really blown away. I found it to be, I was just really blown away. It's interesting stuff you had going on there.
Yeah. Well, I've been sort of on the side of the psychedelic community, but been there for a long time doing my own thing.
Yeah, it makes sense because you had to protect your career for some time. Yeah. All right. So,
okay.
Why don't we start it off here, just easing in? Give me a sense of where you're coming from when you start this work. You were doing high-dose LSD experiences for 20 years. You stopped about 10 years ago, which means that you started doing this 30 years ago. At that point, I believe LSD was already illegal. Can you sort of draw or paint us a picture of the context that you were entering into the decision to do this? And while doing that, can you also explain the difference between what you were doing and what was popular at the time, insofar as psychedelic therapy or psycholytic therapy?
Yeah. Well, I came out of graduate school in 1978. I was trained as a philosopher of religion, and I came to Youngstown State University in Northeast Ohio to begin my teaching career. And at the time, I was an atheistically inclined agnostic. But that first year, I read Stan Grof's first book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, and I immediately connected with it. I felt I had found my life's work. This was 1978. The Controlled Substances Act had been passed in 1970. The early era of psychedelic research was over. And of course, we had entered that blackout between 1970 and when Scientific American had published its front page editorial recommending that we end the ban on psychedelic research in 2014. But there was this blackout. No one was allowed to do this work anymore. I was convinced that it could be done safely, and Stan Grof's work was very important to me in that respect. And I was convinced that the people who would be making the most important contributions in philosophy of religion would soon be being people who are writing out of an experiential basis. So I made the decision to divide my life in half. In my public life, I continued my work as an academic professor, traditional professor, teaching my courses, doing all the things professors do. But in my private life, I began a 20-year journey working with high levels of psychedelics, of LSD, 73 sessions extending over 20 years between 1979 and 1999. I chose to work with high doses first because it was complicated to arrange time for sessions when you have a dual career marriage, two professional people, and I wanted to make the most out of every session. But then after the process got started, I found that I thought it would get me to my goal of enlightenment faster, basically breaking off larger pieces of karma, chewing up larger pieces of karma in every session. After that model of personal enlightenment dissolved, along the way, I continued to work with high doses of LSD because it took me where I wanted to go, and then it took me farther than I ever dreamed was possible.
Now, I'm just going to take a quick pause to clarify something, because high dose LSD is not very clear for the listeners. How high of a dose? What was the metric of dose?
Metric was 500 to 600 micrograms, which is kind of a maximum high dose. Stan's work Stan differentiates between psycholytic or low-dose therapy, averaging about 200 micrograms up to 300. Psychedelic therapy is high dose between 300 and 1500, more typically 300 to 500. But in the early work that he did at Spring Grove Hospital, it was deliberately limited to a maximum of 3 sessions. The idea was to trigger an experience of transcendence that would help people come to terms with their impending death. I thought if you could do this safely 3 times, you could do it safely more frequently. And so I saw myself at the time simply doing an extended dose of high-dose therapy. When I got to the end of this journey, however, and was looking back, I realized that what unfolded on this journey was more radical and more challenging than what had emerged in the early psychedelic therapy work. And so I had to coin a new term, a new phrase for it. So the way I would describe my work now, that psychedelic period, is psychedelic exploration. The method is psychedelic therapy with totally internalized sessions, strong evocative music, working with a sitter, always in a protected, isolated environment, classic set and setting. The difference is the high number of sessions. For me, it turned out to be 73 sessions.
Mm-hmm. Some of the conclusions that you drew are, I just remember having recently listened to some of your lectures and just being so moved by it. And I'm noticing myself now wanting excitedly to ask you basically what you learned in the end, but I know that I'm just like kind of suppressing that urge a little bit, and to maybe deepen into what exactly was happening, and I want to ask that question couched in very specific phenomena that you observed, which was multiple layers of death and rebirth, and like an increasing expansion into, and I'm kind of, I guess, using my own words here, but like of higher levels of reality. Can you sort of couch in this idea of what do you mean by multiple death and rebirth? Can you give us an outline of, what the hell was happening in there after 70 something, or, progressively through 70 something sessions of 500 mics of LSD?
Well, that is the question. And it's hard to summarize. It's taken me about 300 pages just to tell the story of what happened. It's hard to jump into it quickly because there were so many layers. But basically, my experience has been that the universe, or the mind of the universe, or the mind of the divine, is an infinite ocean of potential. And when we drop our individual mind into that ocean, it catalyzes a set of experiences out of that infinite potential. And as we are changed and influenced and healed and purified by that exchange, the seed crystal of our mind changes. And then later, when we drop that same mind, now transformed, into the ocean, it catalyzes a deeper set of experiences out of that infinite potential. So my experience was that there were a series of initiations that took place over many years, a series of deaths followed by a rebirth into a deeper level of reality, and then a gradually acclimating to that level of reality, adjusting to its conditions, going through a purification process, because, as I experienced at least, every deeper level of reality, or every deeper state of consciousness that gave us access to a deeper level of reality, was a higher level of energy. So to stabilize consciousness at that deeper level of consciousness, so that your experience of that deeper level of reality would be coherent and not fragmented, you had to go through a very intense purification process. But if you continued to work at a particular level, if you continue to stay internalized and push, my experience was you would go back to the same level, and I would acclimate to that level. I would begin to have more coherent experiences at that level, and eventually I would come to a point where the death rebirth process would repeat itself. I would go through some agonizing, complete loss of control, and then I would collapse. It'd be an internal collapse, and then I would be reborn into a yet deeper level of consciousness, which gave me access to a deeper level of reality. And this went on systematically, periodically for 20 years. So to describe the levels of consciousness that I entered into, it's a longer story.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was thinking at some point I might ask you a couple, like, what does this mean insofar as, like, why is the chapter titled this? And
yeah,
but maybe because all of this, having listened to the longer story, all of this is very descriptive. But for someone who's just entering into this for the first time, it can be kind of abstract. So maybe you can talk about what this looks like, because I got one description from you that seemed to make a lot of sense to me, which was something like, in the early sessions you were working through your own personal stuff, and that eventually you needed to die to who you were to become, beyond your personality into a greater sense of, like, the underlying human consciousness, and then even at some point to die from that underlying human consciousness into something beyond it. Can you give maybe a step-by-step in the early stages what that looked like?
Yeah. For about the first 2 years, I worked at what Stan Grof describes as the perinatal level of consciousness, which is the interface between your personal reality, your egoic reality in space-time, and early transpersonal consciousness. So I went through many experiences of reliving my own birth, of experiences of death and dying, until eventually, after about 2.5 years, my personal reality was just shattered. I was just crushed and extinguished. I died as the person I had known myself to be. And then I was reborn into a level of reality that radically transcended Chris Bache's reality. And I was working at that point at deep within the collective unconscious, and then the entire process began again. And in my experience, there are 2 phases of every session. There's a cleansing phase, which lasts usually a couple of hours, and then there's an ecstatic phase. So if you enter into the cleansing phase and let it take you wherever it wants to take you, it reaches a peak. You go through some type of crisis, some type of transition, and then the remainder of the session is spent in ecstatic reality, where you receive teachings and experiences. So in the cleansing phase of phase 2, I entered into what I call the ocean of suffering, just domains of pain and suffering that were vast, encompassing large swaths of human history and hundreds of thousands of persons. It took about 2 years to go through all of that material. At the personal side, on the ecstatic side, I was experiencing, for about a year, I experienced my life as a completed whole, start to finish, all the time moments of my life as a simultaneous present. I just kind of experienced my life as a complete totality. And then in the second phase, I went through a series of initiations in which I was taken deep into the mind of the universe and just given a series of teachings and given a series of experiences that basically grounded me in a larger cosmological vision of reality. After about 2 years of that process, I went through another death and rebirth cycle and was spun beyond, not only beyond my individual reality, but also beyond my reality as a human species altogether, beyond the collective psyche, into what I identified as archetypal reality. But it wasn't the archetypes described by either Plato or Carl Jung. It was both. I mean, it had certain features similar to Plato's description and certain features of Jung's description, but it really had other features that did not fit in their description. The realities that I encountered there at the high archetypal level were not eternal, unchanging ideas in the mind of God, as Plato describes it, but vast, living, cosmic forces, giant beings so vast, my mind literally could not wrap itself around it. I could only get approximations of the scale of their dimensions. At the slightly beneath that, at the Jungian level, I entered deep into the collective psyche, and then for a couple of years had all sorts of experiences of how our species functions as a single organism. Was taken deep into the sort of meta-neural networks of the species mind, and also began to have experiences of reincarnation, but not as an individual, not from the perspective of individual souls, but from the perspective of an entire species that was incarnating every generation, a whole generation of its beings, and experiencing the centralized intelligence that was kind of orchestrating or collaborating with the individual souls to facilitate not just an individual journey of transformation, but to facilitate a species journey of transformation. And I went through another round of death and rebirth. I'm skipping over, of course, a lot of things. But,
Right.
And then I was catapulted into what some people call causal reality, into non-dual reality, and where the entire universe began to function as a single totality, and had a number of experiences of what the Buddhists call shunyata, emptiness of self, oneness, cosmic love, experiences of the primal void, the fertile void, the formlessness that is the source of all existence. After that, then I was coming into the last 5 years of work, and the last 5 years catapulted me, after, again, more rounds of purification, death, and rebirth, into a cosmic light that was so intense and so clear and so pure. I called it the diamond luminosity, and that's where the title of the book comes from, Diamonds from Heaven. Buddhism calls this the absolute clear light. It associates it with its concept of Dharmakaya, the fundamental reality that is the source of all existence. Now, let me back up. Light entered into the experiences. There are many, many levels of light, many gradations of light in my experience. I had experienced light many times in earlier death rebirth processes. So when I talk about the diamond light, I'm not simply using metaphor to describe that light. I'm trying to describe a particularly intense, exceptionally clear state of awareness of crystalline light that becomes so clear it eventually becomes transparent to itself. And in those last 5 years, in the last 26 sessions, which was actually about 1/3 of all of my work, I entered that reality 4 times. Wow. And just 4 times. So about once a year, I would be catapulted into this reality, and then I would go through more detoxification, more purification, and about a year later would enter into this reality one more time. So that's the kind of larger overview.
Right. Good. And I'm glad that you stopped there, because there's some your closing experiences I want to get to near the end. But I want to maybe jump back a little bit and focus on what you're talking about here with this purification, and also with this idea of becoming more coherent. Now, when you say purification, what exactly do you mean? Because my immediate assumption is something akin to, what the ayahuasca culture calls purging, where you're basically pushing out or releasing or letting go or discharging suffering, pain, hardships, whatever, through the active metabolic process of feeling them. So that you can, having let those go, enter into a state a state of being that exists without them. Is that what you mean when you're saying purification?
Yeah. That's a good description. It is that. It's physiological. I mean, people throw up a lot on ayahuasca. They don't tend to think of LSD as something that causes throwing up, but to me, I was working with such high levels, I threw up a lot on LSD, and that's part of this whole releasing of physical toxins, biochemical toxins, psychological toxins, just letting them come through your system and offload in very rapid sequences. When you move into deeper levels, it takes different forms. I mean, to sort of, if you want to become to enter into very, very deep states of consciousness, where you enter into unitive consciousness with the divine, or different dimensions of existence, or different dimensions of the cosmos, you have to completely let go of everything in your life which keeps you small. So it's not just negative experiences, it's not just pain, it's every thought form, every emotional derivative that constellates around smallness. But you have to sort of allow your system to step up to handle the enormous waves of energy that move through you in these very deep states of consciousness. So purification begins at the personal level. You're purifying all sorts of pieces of your personal history, including your former life history. But as you go deeper and deeper, the forms of purification become harder to identify with anything personal. They become, and eventually you literally are transcending time and space. And there is a sense in which you have to empty yourself of everything associated with your entire history of being a time and space being to enter into realities beyond time and space. But it is exactly as the ayahuasca, the Santa Daime tradition describes it. It is a purga. It's a letting go. It's a manifesting and letting go of those realities.
I'm, given that we're talking about transcending time and space, I'm going to assume that it's transcends linguistic form as well. But I'm just curious, like, what does it feel like to? I know what it feels like to purify or discharge sadness.
Yeah,
I know what it feels like to feel like the grief and the fear, particularly the grief of letting go of who I think I am, or who I thought I was.
Yeah.
But it really, it's mind blowing. Really, is there a way that you could describe in language what it's like to purify, let go of your very essence of being bound by time and space?
Well, your question really penetrates right to some very heart of some very thorny issues. Let me mention before we jump into it. Ineffability is taken as one of the signature qualities of a genuine mystical experience. William James first brought it in and has been incorporated into some of the diagnostic questionnaires to assess the depth of one's mystical experience. Personally, I think ineffability is overrated. So these things are hard to put into words. They are hard to find ways of expressing experiences that you enter into in these realities. But my experience is when you first break into a new level of reality, it is hard to get it down on paper. It is hard to find words. And there are some tricks that I learned in order to concretize my recall of these experiences. But what I found is if you keep going back to the same level of reality over and over again, if you go through this purification process and consciousness stabilizes at that level of reality, your cognition becomes clearer. You begin to understand how this works. The pieces begin to cohere, and it becomes easier and easier to find the right words to describe it. Then when you break into a new level of reality, the same dynamic repeats itself, that you're kind of overwhelmed by the enormity of something different. But if you keep going back with focus, you will be able to stabilize it. The particular experience that you're talking about of letting go all of your experience in time and space, well, partly I experience it as a matter of fear. You're becoming something so large that it's swallowing everything you've ever known, not only swallowing everything you've ever known as an individual, but there's a sense in which when you're working at that level, even to push that particular boundary, you are no longer an individual having gotten to that level. There's a sense in which you're functioning as a species. You're functioning as a fractal member of an entire human species. And then at a deeper level, you're not even a species. You're somehow a fractal embodiment of an entire evolutionary impulse that's been manifesting galaxies and solar systems and planets and evolving life. So you literally have already dissolved into those deeper patterns. So you're not an individual having a transpersonal experience. You have surrendered into that part of the universe that lives as a galaxy, that lives as an evolutionary thrust. So when it comes to the point of letting go of that and entering into something which is where the Big Bang came from, and entering in the domain of formlessness itself, it feels less like a personal crisis. It feels like almost an evolutionary crisis or a species anxiety. But if you let go, the universe takes you in and you just lose all frames of reference. And then suddenly you're alive within a different reality. I mean, it's hard to describe because I say you're alive, but you're not who you were before. But there is a thread of memory that connects who you were inside time and space to who you are in this reality, which is outside time and space. But what you are experiencing, you're literally adrift in the mind of God, so to speak. You're in the cosmos as part of the tidal currents of the cosmos.
Like part of, but also as the tidal currents? Like it's not just like, oh, I am in the universe. Is there like a sense of being all of that as well?
Yes. I mean, basically, in each deeper and deeper level, I experienced it as a remembering. I wasn't entering a reality that I was not. I was remembering a dimension of my own existence that I had forgotten about. So becoming one with God is not a matter of confronting an external deity, which you then merge with. Becoming one with God, or I don't even like to use the word God because of all the historical associations, the baggage that comes with it. But to become one with that reality, with that fundamental reality, it's a matter of remembering. It's a remembering the fundamental truth that that's what you are. You are a manifestation. You are a fractal embodiment of an aspect of this divine impulse. So the whole experience is, as you become larger, you remember more. As you remember more, you become clearer. As you become clearer, you enter deeper and deeper into these ocean currents. But always the sense of waking up. You're waking up. It's not really about dying and being reborn. It's just a matter of waking up to something that is your true and natural condition.
So I might be jumping the gun here, as they say, but I feel like this might be a good time to ask something that I wanted to save till later, and then I'll jump back afterwards.
Okay.
I'm assuming that you're familiar with the anecdotal reports of 5-MeO DMT that have been really growing a lot over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people who are, we'll say, the people of the five, they experience and then claim that what happens is like, this is the ultimate non-dual experience. And you become like the apex of consciousness in some way, like the God. And in your experience, you at one point even got to what could be described as this apex. Maybe this is this diamond luminosity. And then at some point realized that there was something even further beyond that as well. I'm curious, given your experiences, like your deep experiences with high dose LSD over such a long time, and these entrances into different levels of consciousness, how do you feel about the sort of the larger cosmological or metaphysical claim that's being made by people who are experiencing 5-MeO DMT?
Yeah. First, I'm really comfortable with the 5-MeO DMT discussion. I mean, I think it's a fascinating substance. It has this capacity to just catapult us through so many layers and give us a short immersion into those deep, deep cosmic territories. But in some ways, the situation is similar, I think, to people who have near-death episodes, who just walking down the street, they have a heart attack and they almost die and they're knocked out of their body, and they have a powerful transcendental experience which lasts minutes, hours, and then they come back into their body and they're trying to understand what it is they experienced. And if you have fleeting contact with these realities, at one level you know what they are, you can feel what they are, there is a sense in which you are immersed in the ultimate, but it may be because they are so short-term and so singular, I think sometimes we draw premature conclusions about what they imply for the nature of the universe itself. So at least here's why I suspect that. When I was doing this work, and I got to the point where I was in those last 5 years, and I was in that series of immersions into what I call the diamond luminosity, past oneness, past, merging with the divine into some level that felt even beyond causal reality. I'd gone into it once. I went into it a second time. This was my 50th session. And then towards the end of that session, I had an unusual experience. I was as far out as I'd ever gone. I was totally, absolutely at peace, floating, merged with this light. And then suddenly everything pivoted 90 degrees, and I saw a reality that was far, far removed, and this reality was light-soaked, and a beam of light came out of that reality and hit me, and it just absolutely shattered me. It was a completely different order of light beyond even the diamond luminosity that it had taken me 15 years to get to. And that's when I realized, I called it the absolute light just to give it a name, but that's when I realized that it's an infinite progression. And I completely gave up to the idea that we could ever get to the end of it. See, when I had started this work, I thought there was an end state. You did this work and you reached some definitive end of the process. And some people talked about us becoming one with God or becoming one with the universe. Some people talked about entering the primal void or the suprametacosmic void. And I had entered those states of oneness, and I discovered that there are actually many gradations of oneness. And I had entered formlessness, but I discovered that there are actually gradations of formlessness. And this experience convinced me that even using this very powerful method, the universe was just much, much larger than I had imagined it to be, and that there was no way I was going to ever be able to come to the end, some end. And I just realized that was a false expectation on my part. And then what happened in the sessions is that the sessions stopped taking me farther out, and the diamond luminosity began to crunch itself deeper, more and more deeply into my physical body. The next year, 2 years of work were all about having that diamond light crunch into my physiology, into my psychology, into my neural anatomy. So I really do understand those senses of ultimacy that emerge in these experiences. I think that's a phenomenologically accurate description. But kind of as a metaphysician, I would bracket discussions of ultimacy, because I'm really not sure that we are in a position as a species, even using these very, very powerful substances, to make safe claims about what is ultimate or not.
Yes, cool. Thank you very much. Now, we're going to put a pin in that and jump back.
Okay.
And talk a little bit more about purification and coherency. You make a comment, you've made the comment multiple times, and maybe you could just sort of clarify it a bit now, that you have to effort at some point and get familiar with certain states of consciousness, at which point you become coherent there. You hold a coherent cognition while in these higher energy states of consciousness. Can you maybe just explain that a little bit more deeper, and possibly, how it is that you do that?
Yeah. Well, this was a learn as you go process. I wasn't part of a psychedelic culture. I didn't have a shaman kind of helping me through this process. I was really having to figure it out as I went, and I was using a medicine that didn't have a lot of history. It didn't have psychedelics, didn't have fields associated with it the way that mushrooms do and the way that ayahuasca does. It's really a relatively new medicine, and therefore it very much was taking me to an edge. My experience, when I read the literature of people's psychedelic experiences, particularly their experiences with LSD or other very powerful psychedelics, I saw the different ways that they were touching all sorts of different levels of reality, but I also saw a lot of confusion and a lot of fragmentation in their experience. It was as if they were getting bits and pieces. And I found that when they were describing multiple sessions, it was as if they were always starting over again. They were always getting to this space where they were having these experiences, but there wasn't a progressive developmental sequence. My experience was different than that. I experienced myself as being engaged in a long, sustained conversation, which deepened into a communion with a consciousness, which never took any form. It never took a particular symbolic form. But it always was there, and it was orchestrating my sessions. It was determining what happened in the sessions. All I had to do was show up, let it take me where it would take me, and then make sense of what would happen. And making sense of what happened involved methodically recording the session, thinking about it extensively after the session. It wasn't simply just a matter of having a clean context environment, so good set, good setting, good preparation, all those things. It was a matter of thoroughly thinking about, processing, trying to integrate intellectually as well as personally, emotionally, and physically the experiences that you were having. So, I mean, I was trained as a philosopher, and I was trained as an analytic philosopher. So when I would enter these states, I would try to enter into it as clearly as I could and take in as much as I possibly could and understand as much as I could and retain as much as I could. And I found that if you meet the universe, or if you meet these states with that kind of devotion to engagement, it will orchestrate your experience and take you as deep as you have the capacity to go. But you have to hold the posture at your end. You have to do your work. You have to do your side. And your side, for me, involved paying attention, surrendering, having the courage to let it take me where it would take me, having the courage to die again and again in this process, but then writing it down, thinking about it, trying to figure it out, put the pieces all together, and let it unfold.
Interesting. Yeah, that's great. And later, before we end, I'd like to ask you a bit about your thoughts and advice on integration. But you having said that, and when I first heard it, really it echoed something that I hadn't been able to give words to before. I wrote a book on working with psilocybin mushrooms, and that is exactly what happened to me over the course of an extended period of time of using it monthly. It was like each time I used it, I got with this like pay attention, surrender, and trust the process. I just got a greater level of cognitive coherency so that I could come back. I would do all the writing, I'd explore it, that I could, accurately articulate this is exactly what's happening, and here's how it comes about, and here's, well, for me anyways, at these dose levels. So that was that's a really cool language. And unless you want to particularly comment on that, I have another question here for you.
No, I completely understand. It's interesting how our experiences are so congruent with different psychedelics. Each psychedelic has its own quality, but the phenomenon of engagement is the same in all of them.
You definitely went much deeper than I did. Actually, okay, we're going to just put everything on hold for a second, because you said something else one time that I thought was very interesting. And I'll just ask you outright, because I get this question a lot. What is the difference between LSD and psilocybin?
Yeah, well,
I mean this phenomenologically, not...
Yeah, phenomenologically. Yeah. I think of psilocybin as very much of a kind of a body-grounded psychedelic. I feel it very strongly in my body. It really, when I'm in a psilocybin state, this intelligence, it almost as if it enters into my body, it sweeps through my body, checks it out, can identify what's going on here, there, touches the emotional feels, and my whole body hums and glows when I'm with psilocybin. Something very similar with ayahuasca. It feels very, it takes your whole body into the experience. my experience working, again, with high doses of LSD, and it's different with lower doses, but with high doses of LSD, it is such an enormous acceleration, such an enormous catapulting into deep, deep states of consciousness. It almost as if, this isn't really quite true, but in certain ways, it almost as if it tends to leave the body behind. And there's a way in which integrating the body into those states of consciousness takes time and comes later. There's a tendency to, it's not a dissociative psychedelic like ketamine is, but it tends to sort of drive to what I would call the high cosmological ceiling. It tends to throw you into the high cosmological ceiling, and it doesn't give you, for example, at least in my experience, it didn't give me contact with the elemental spirits, with the earth spirits, with the totem ancestors of the animal or vegetable kingdom. It just wasn't working at that level. It tends to be kind of drive towards the cosmological ceiling, so to speak. So it would drive me beyond my personal ego, and then it drove me into the species consciousness, and then it drove me into earth consciousness, and then it started taking me even beyond that territory.
Cool, thank you.
I found later that using psilocybin actually kind of helped me integrate some of my LSD experiences, precisely because it tended to open up my body and allowed some of that high cosmological energy to enter more easily into my physical form.
Now, were you taking higher doses of psilocybin or more average, say 5 dried grams of mushrooms, or were you entering into Kalindi territory where you're at 20, 30 grams, 40, 50 grams of mushrooms?
I was probably working in more standardized doses with psilocybin. I wasn't really trying. And much of the work I did with psilocybin was after I had stopped the LSD work. I did some intermittently along the way. But after I stopped the LSD work, I worked with psilocybin and some with ayahuasca. And what I found is that it was very helpful towards integration. I didn't feel like I was breaking new territory, and I wasn't trying to break new territory. I was trying to recover from the territory I'd already broken into. I was trying to basically learn how to walk on the earth again after having so many transcendental experiences.
Well, I would be very curious to see you and Kalindi compare notes of ultra high dose tryptamines. But let's go back now that we're okay. We've explored that.
Okay.
Increasing, cognitive coherency at increasing levels of high energy consciousness.
Yeah.
Mixing this with purification. Okay. So what I'm curious about, did it get easier or did it stay about the same as you progressed? And what I mean by this is, okay, so in the early phases, you're struggling with all the pain and grief of just letting go of being a white, highly educated philosopher, a male. This is one of your stories into becoming something else, like the entire female side of our species, over time. You're struggling with that, the pain and grief of that, maybe pain and grief of past traumas or whatever it is. And then, fast forward 15 years and you're facing the fear and the discomfort and the challenge of letting go of all time and space. And somewhere in the middle of that, you're in what did you call it? The sea of suffering, where you're experiencing the suffering of the entire species of humanity, over all time simultaneously, is what you were experiencing in those later phases, was that about the same level of challenge with a greater psychic magnitude, or did it get easier? Did it stay this? This is what I'm curious about, really. Yeah.
The ocean of suffering was much harder, much more demanding to experience than the dissolution of my private ego. It's a different order of magnitude. I have to go back to think of something I thought while you were asking the question. I'm beginning to lose it now. Okay. I want to be careful not to overemphasize the negative, because there's a steady rhythm. There's the purification phase of a session, and then there's the ecstatic phase. And to me, the only thing that makes it possible to endure the purification phase are the blessings that you're giving in the ecstatic phase. So when I was processing the ocean of suffering after a session, it wasn't just the ocean of suffering that I was processing. I was also processing the enormous gift of my early unitive experiences, my early experiences of being taken on what I call the cosmic tour, my early experience of being taken back to the beginning of creation. So it's all sorts of wonderful ecstatic experiences are part of that. And this rhythm kept up all the way through. There was a rhythm of purification and a rhythm of blessing. And the blessings always kept pace with the magnitude and the scale of the purification. So the deeper the purification went, the deeper the blessings became. Until eventually, once you learn that rhythm, once you learn that all you have to do is follow the purification as deeply as it goes, and there will be blessings waiting for you at the end. At that point, you literally begin to not avoid purification. You seek it out. You want to go as deeply into that muck as you can, not because you're a glutton for pain and suffering. You're a glutton for what lies on the other side of that pain and suffering. Now, in some ways, the rhythm itself gets easier. Once you know that that's the rhythm, it gets easier because there's less fear associated with it. The ordeal may be intense, but it doesn't frighten you as deeply. You may get transiently terrified, but you trust the process. You keep going deeper into it. One of the worst, in the sense experientially most demanding sessions I ever had actually was the 70th session. It was the last great vision. I was given a series of what I would call the great visions in my work over the years. But the 70th session put me through a tear down, a rip down that was worse than anything I'd ever gone through before. So in some ways it gets easier. But then if the universe wants to take you very, very deep, in order to get to that depth, it's got to put you through a process that you need in order to stabilize consciousness in that depth. And in this case, it took me deeper into what I call deep time than it had ever taken me before. I coined the term deep time to describe a particular experience with respect to time and transcending time. You can go outside of time altogether into eternity and escape the envelope of space-time altogether. But I had many experiences of experiencing certain units of time, certain spans of time as an organic whole. So this began early on by experiencing my complete life as a totality start to finish. And then I began to experience evolution, the evolution of the universe and the evolution of humanity in terms of a time frame of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. So there was like my consciousness was extended to 100,000 years, and I could experience how the universe experiences that 100,000 years, not how Chris Bache might experience that. So deep time became a term that I used to describe different modalities of time. And eventually I became convinced that these modalities weren't simply projections, and they weren't simply, shuffling the cards of how Chris Bache experiences time, but somehow I was being taken into how the universe experiences time. And the universe, as you move more towards the edge of space-time, time itself begins to be more porous. This last session, well, let me back up. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is many experiences that I had, which eventually became a story of the evolution of the human race and where we are in our evolutionary story, and the particular crisis that we are coming into as I think our entire species is trying to outgrow the egoic psychology of the past and move into a much deeper experience of being a human, which is much more soul-oriented, much more transparent to each other and to the divine. The 70th session that I referenced was my deepest excursion into deep time which took me deep into humanity's future and gave me one of my clearest experiences of what I call the future human, the human being that humanity is in the process of becoming, our next evolutionary type. Okay. So it gets easier, but you never know when, it can come up and slap you hard if it wants to take you somewhere special.
Yeah, that's something I learned all too well, and is definitely shared amongst the other deep explorers that I know. It's just like, just be careful, because as soon as you get brazen, it'll teach you a lesson. An oddball comes, no matter how competent you feel. So maybe now is a good time to move into some closing, because we're just about the hour mark here, pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
You stopped doing this.
Yeah.
And I kind of already have a sense of where the answer is going, so I'm curious how to ask the question, because I'm simultaneously wondering, why did you stop?
Yeah.
While also wondering, what did these experiences, how did they change your relationship to dying? Like your physical death as human now. Yeah, that's sort of like the large open-ended question. Yeah.
Well, let me take that last question first, because it's the easiest. I'm so looking forward, not necessarily to the process of dying, but I am so looking forward to being dead with absolute and complete confidence, because I know where I'm going. I've died. I've made that transition so many times in my sessions. I feel very comfortable with what's going to be happening after this body falls away. Okay. I stopped these sessions. It's not that I stopped sessions altogether, but I stopped this particular series of sessions. I stopped working with high doses of LSD for two reasons. One was pain and the other was heartache. When you're working with such extremely high doses of LSD, there's just an enormous demands. It places enormous demands on your body and on your subtle energy system. And what I found, and this I talk about in Diamonds from Heaven, what I found is that after many years, my energy was just running so hot. I was carrying too much energy. It was like I was almost never comfortable in my body. I wasn't having flashbacks or anything like that, but literally my subtle energy system was so taxed by entering in and out of these states in a rhythmic, even just 5 times a year, that I had to stop to let my whole system calm down, cool down, and find its new equilibrium. But the main reason I stopped is different. The main reason I stopped was heartache. I literally could not take the heartache of being separated from the divine anymore. I had entered and was entering so deeply into the diamond luminosity, so deeply into the crystalline nature of whatever you want to call it, the divine or the absolute, or I had dissolved and lost my body, my boundaries, and entered and become light so many times and with such exquisite joy that coming back into time-space became just a terrible heartache. And eventually I reached a point where I decided better not to go back at all than to have to go and leave. And so I made a kind of an agreement with, I call the absolute, my words for the absolute are my beloved, because it was a love relationship that unfolded. So I made a deal with my beloved to never take me back that deeply again until I would not have to leave. And that's really why I stopped my sessions. I thought that I could just, because I really paid a lot of attention to integration all the way through the process. I really tried to do it right, do all the things you do to really solidly integrate each individual session. And I thought that I could therefore stop my sessions, and then I would be able to harvest the insights and the experiences that I had been blessed with during those years. What I found was, however, that in the years following, really a number of years, I began to enter into what I call the deep sadness. I began to enter into a sense of existential loneliness. I was missing the divine so deeply, back now in time and space, that basically life had began to feel all dried up. I really wasn't that interested in being here. And I found that I was just waiting to die. I was just waiting to die so I could return to the light. And the years passed, and I began to realize slowly that this isn't good. This is not the way it's supposed to be. I knew that this was not the way it was supposed to end up. And I didn't understand what had happened because I had been so careful with integration all the way through. It wasn't clear to me where I had gone wrong. But my life was screaming, failure to integrate, failure to integrate. In time, I began to realize that what had happened was I had lost a balance between transcendence and immanence, between letting go and going beyond all time-space reality and being grounded solidly within time and space reality. Time and space is the manifest body of the divine. I know it's the divine. I've experienced it as the manifest being of the divine. It's not that there are two divines, there's just the transcendent divine and the immanent divine. But I had plunged so deeply into the transcendent divine that I kind of lost my foothold. I lost my grounding in the immanent divine. And it took about 10 years, but I made a determined commitment to reground myself into physical existence, to temper my memories of transcendence with my appreciation and enjoyment of the manifest divine around me continuously. And that took a long time, but eventually I did. And eventually I became more comfortable being here. One of the things I ran into in going through this process, one of the challenges wasn't simply withdrawing from this intimate communion. It was living in the silence that had been imposed on me by our psychedelic phobic culture. I wasn't allowed to speak about my experiences. I couldn't teach from them. I could not bring them to my colleagues. I could not really write in complete abandon. I could not do what I had been trained to do as a philosopher of religion. I couldn't philosophize based on these experiences. I wasn't part of a psychedelic subset in Ohio. And I knew that if I began this conversation, I would be fired. And I love to teach. I love being with my students. So this split between my public life and my private life became increasingly burdensome. And then when I stopped the sessions, it became even more burdensome that I didn't have a place to process my experiences. So what I found is that there's a level of integration that could take place privately, psychologically, before I started to speak. And then when I began working on Diamonds from Heaven and I began to give the talks as this book was coming to its conclusion, and I began to share with people what I had actually done and where it had gone, so I could not only share what I had experienced, but take in what they had experienced, I found that the integration of those experiences began to deepen. They began to live in me differently than they had lived before I began to speak about them. And that's begun a process that's still continuing to unfold. I don't know where it's going to go, but somehow the transcendent divine and the immanent divine seem to be reaching a deeper merging, a deeper synthesis in my life now that I've finally, shared the conversation. I've opened the conversation. Yes.
There's a couple more questions I have for you if you've got the time.
Yeah.
This one might be a bit quick. You were uncomfortable physically because of this, high subtle energy. Were you doing any physical spiritual practices, yoga, tai chi, anything like that?
Yeah, I was doing meditation and Vajra during all of my years, and in the last 5 years, I was really doing formal Vajrayana practices. I was taking good care of my body. I was doing yoga. I was really maintaining a very careful, at that time, a vegetarian diet. I was really taking a lot of care of my body. I was doing chiropractic care. I was doing massages. I was really taking care of the instrument.
Okay, cool. I was curious about, because that might be an area where it's like, oh, maybe if you were doing yoga, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Cool. So this other question is very personal. Well, I mean, everything you've shared is obviously very personal, but this is the kind of personal that a lot of people hesitate to share. So you certainly don't have to answer this, no pressure, which is, what kind of a toll did these experiences take on your capacity to be intimate with other people? Because I know for myself, when I was, it's less now, but when I was going regularly very deep into my mushroom experiences, I often felt very existentially alone, and like I couldn't relate to other people, and I couldn't relate to, I felt like there was this vital area of relationship in my romantic partnerships that was always missing because they didn't go there as well. And so I always felt alone in those explorations. And so I'm just curious, what kind of because I'm assuming that your intimate partners weren't going as like regularly deep as yourself. What kind of a impact did that have on your ability to be at the human level and be intimately relating with other people or with lovers?
Yeah. I know exactly what you're referring to. I understand that loneliness, and that loneliness was the unexpected cost of doing this work. Of all the things I had anticipated entering into this essentially a shamanic path, the loneliness and separation from other people was the most unexpected. And it's kind of curious because of the experiences, my capacity to enter into other people's lives, to empathically enter into their experience, had deepened enormously. But unless they were psychedelically initiated themselves, they had no capacity to understand what were, to me, the most important experiences of my life. And so naturally, a certain distance grew up between myself and my social relationships. And this, anyway, so there is a sense, the world, there's a place in Carlos Castaneda's book where Don Juan is talking to Don Gennaro, and Gennaro says the world is only real when I'm with him, meaning Don Juan, which means there's a sense in which if you take up the psychedelic path or any practice which really opens up deeper and deeper levels of experience, it does it inevitably separates you. You're on a different road than the people around you who are interested only in physical, tangible things. And so there is a loneliness that comes with that. I find that this loneliness for me, is easing as I become more public and I enter into conversations with people like yourself who have had their own experiences, and we can share these things, and it's easier. Now, in terms of my most intimate relationships, I've been very blessed in that respect. I've been married twice. Carol was my first wife. We were married for 24 years. She was my wife during all the years when I was doing this work. She was my sitter in all of this work. She is a very mystically inclined person. She's a deep Buddhist practitioner. She never was interested in doing sessions. It just wasn't. They always seemed too violent for her. She really was a meditator. Everything she needed, she found on her meditation cushion. And in some ways, it wasn't until I began at very advanced levels of this engagement, when I was moving into the diamond luminosity, that I felt like I began to understand her for the first time. So she was a highly developed spiritual being. After we have separated and she has remarried and I have remarried, she has gone on to complete her Vajrayana training. She's done her 3-year, 3-month retreat with her teacher in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Tukul Sanak. So she's a serious practitioner. And so I didn't experience lack of headroom in my conversation with her. I always felt like in some ways, even though the experiences were different, but in some ways, the more I did this work, the closer we were coming existentially in that way. And after I stopped my sessions, we came to a point where we separated for reasons that don't have to do with the sessions themselves. We just came to a parting of our ways, and we're still friends. And but then I was blessed with a second marriage with Christina Hardy, and Christina Hardy is also a journeyer, so she understood experientially the dimensions that I had entered into. She understood them from her own experience. She's also an astrologer, so she's very deeply a daughter of the earth and a daughter of the stars. So she kind of lives deeply grounded in the reality and the textures of time and space and in the rhythms of time and space. So that in my most intimate relationships, I've been blessed to be with two women who were able to understand the unique experiences that I was going through. It would have been very lonely to be with people where you experience intimacy at one level, but you don't experience that intimacy at another level. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The final question that I have, I want to hold on it for a second because you said something and I just want to make sure I understand, because if I understand, I think it's an important point. You said that your first wife she did not want to do what you were doing because she found it too violent. And you said at a certain point you began to understand her. Is that what you mean? You started to understand why she wouldn't choose to do what you were doing?
No, it wasn't that particularly. I shouldn't say focus just on the violence. She's a very gentle and a naturally mystically oriented person, and she found the vehemence of the cleansing portion of the sessions very hard for her to relate to. She also found the temporary nature, that you would have these deep temporary experiences, but then you would come back and you couldn't hold on. You could remember them, but you couldn't embody them. And she was more attracted to a path where you basically could hold on to more of your experiences. It was a slower path of initiation, but you could hold on to more of your experiences. Mm-hmm. What I mean was, when I say I began to be able to understand her more deeply, there is a sense in which her natural way of tuning into the universe, and the universe that she tuned into, that is what I began to appreciate more deeply. That when I began to touch into the diamond luminosity, I touched into a reality that was so absorbing and so powerful for me that basically nothing else in my sessions mattered except reconnecting with that reality. And I began to appreciate how her entire life, ever since she had been a girl, had been oriented towards accessing and stabilizing this deep participation in the universe.
Okay.
That's what it was.
Yes, I gotcha. I'm glad for the clarification, because I might have misunderstood as you know, you've said in your talks elsewhere that that you wouldn't recommend this path for other people, and that, you know, if you could go back, you would be, you know, quote, easier on yourself. And so I wondered if that's what you were leaning towards.
I would be gentler for a number of reasons. One is because I learned that it's not a matter of getting to an end destination. It's a matter of becoming open, letting as much of the infinite enter into your being as you can absorb. And if that's the approach, if it's really about grounding the transcendent experiences here and now in this body, then that is often served better by working with lower doses that allow you to hold on to more of what you experience. So I really don't recommend what I did. I mean, I really think I pushed myself. It took a great deal of concentration, a great deal of commitment to go some of the places I went, and I don't think it's necessary in order to spiritually wake up to go where I went. I just have more compassion for myself, and I wouldn't want anybody to undergo some of the things I went through.
Okay, thank you. So the final question before the the understandable opportunity to promote your new book and get people more connected with you is about integration. Maybe a fuller understanding for us, like what it means to integrate, because there's one thing about writing the stuff down. I remember you had explained that the next day you would write it down, like narrativize it, listening to the same music you listened to during the session, and that you would name each session so that as soon as you looked at the name, you would have a sense of what that session contained, which is brilliant. Thank you on behalf of all psychedelic explorers. Thank you for that. And you've also mentioned the vital importance of relationship in the integration process in other talks. And so those two things sort of laid out. How do you integrate something as profound and massive as the things that you had gone through?
Yeah. I think some of the challenges, the personal challenges that I faced around integration is one of the reasons I precisely would recommend that people don't do what I did, precisely because with these substances, we can project ourselves, we can dissolve so deeply into these vast territories that it truly becomes mind-boggling. How do you integrate them? In fact, as long as you're staying inside time and space and you're uncovering your pains of your past and you're uncovering trauma for this life or former lives, we have therapeutic models for what integration looks like and how to do it. And if you go deeper and you experience the intelligence that runs through all things and you experience the certainty of continuity of life after death, we still have spiritual models for what it means to integrate those experiences into our life. And when you look at the near-death episode research, people who have very deep one-time experiences of transcendence, we have a sense of how to integrate that material. But it truly is one of the leftover questions of my life is, what does integration mean when you're going so deep into deep time? How do you integrate 100,000-year swaths of time into Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday consciousness? How do you integrate becoming one when you are, just one among many again? Right. How do you integrate going so deep into the future that you're looking at the next evolutionary stage of the human process? How do you integrate that with coming back and going back to work in the morning? After I finished my sessions, shortly thereafter, in my morning meditation, Spirit said to me, 20 years in, 20 years out. And I thought, okay, I understood what that meant. It would take me at least 20 years to integrate the experiences that I'd cultivated over those 20 years. And I thought, that sounds about right. But now Dark Night, The Diamonds from Heaven will be published 20 years after I stopped my session. So I really have been looking at how much I've been able to hold on to during those 20 years and where it's taken me. And as I mentioned, the depth of the loneliness that I experienced was not because of a failure in my sessions. It was actually because of success. The success that you have entering into the universe becomes the challenge of integration when you come back. Again, I found that as long as I was keeping silent, as long as I was really not communicating from my center about these experiences, integration could only proceed to a certain level. When I wrote Dark Night, Early Dawn, where I first began to unpack some of these experiences, that allowed me to enter into some conversations that allowed this integration, this deeper integration, to manifest. But it wasn't really until I began to write Diamonds from Heaven that I began to experience a deeper level of integration manifest. And I guess the way I would put it is like this. I don't think you can integrate the infinite into the finite. By its very definition almost. You can't integrate infinity into finite existence. The only thing you can do is integrate your finite existence into infinity. You must surrender to the infinite, moment to moment, day to day, opportunity to opportunity. You must kind of become a servant of the infinite, surrender completely to that involutionary process that Sri Aurobindo talks about. And I think that I mean, I'm a teacher. My natural instinct is to learn and to share. And the laws around psychedelics interrupted my own natural way of being in the world. Now that I'm retired, now that I've passed my statute of limitations for my psychedelic crimes, now that I can speak about these things, now that I can, those two different sides of my life are coming together. And really, for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm beginning to be a whole person again. And as I'm beginning to be a whole person, something is happening in my relationship within myself and the universe, and also something is happening in my relationship with other people. Because the depth of the consciousness which is alive in me is also the depth of the consciousness that's alive in you. And so when we come together, this deeper kind of, fluctuation surfaces underneath both of us. And I find this when I'm teaching and when I'm working in workshops or with groups, there's a deeper aliveness that in earlier years I had to hold at bay. I had to kind of tamp down. Now it's beginning, now I can let it come through. Now it comes forward. I don't know where this deeper integration is going to go. I don't know where it's going to take me. It's taking me places that I have not been before, except in the sessions, but in times of my physical consciousness, my time-space consciousness, there is a certain transparency that catches me up that's fresh. And there is a certain wholeness that arises when I'm with people that is fresh, and I don't know where it's going to go. Another 20 years of this, I have no idea where it's going to lead me, but I like it. It feels natural, and it feels like integration is continuing to take place. So I don't consider myself finished with this integration process at all.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for that, Chris, and thank you so much for this whole conversation today.
Me too. Thank you.
Maybe you could end us off with letting the listeners know where they can find out more about you, where they could get your I'm not sure if your Diamonds from Heaven is released yet, but your 3 books, what their names are, as well as your social media handles.
Well, actually, my website is still in the process of being made, so can't go there yet, but soon. Diamonds from Heaven, the book that we've been talking about, will be released from Inner Traditions in 2019, probably next summer. It'll be in the second half of 2019. My 3 earlier books was first Life Cycles, which is a book on reincarnation research. The second book was Dark Night, Early Dawn, where I basically am integrating psychedelic research and incorporating my own experiences with near-death episode research and out-of-body research. So it's an extensive, unfortunately, kind of academically dense, if rigorous, but dense discussion of some of these issues. The third book is called The Living Classroom. All of these are available on Amazon. The Living Classroom basically is describing something that was happening in my classroom while I was doing my psychedelic work in the backside. I don't talk about psychedelics there at all, but it's about fields of consciousness. It's about the contagious nature of states of consciousness, because what I found was that when I was doing this work and keeping it private from all my students, nevertheless, some of my students started to be activated by my own work. And so I began to understand and have to work with the contagious quality of states of consciousness. And then Diamonds from Heaven is the book just finished, where I basically go back to the very beginning and simply take people through layer by layer the entire sequence of events. Because I found that you can't even begin the philosophical conversation about psychedelic states unless people, in this case editors of professional journals and things, unless they're convinced that these are legitimate experiences. And the only 2 ways to be convinced that these are legitimate experiences is to either have the experiences yourself or to undergo a secondary initiation by reading other people's accounts of their experiences and kind of picking up on it through kind of osmosis. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm hoping that Diamonds from Heaven, I don't think my experiences are special or unique in any way. They may have pushed a little harder than some people, but I think they fall within the broad range of experiences that people have. I'm just trying to lay them out in an organized fashion so that people can become more familiar with these states. And I hope hopefully it'll help people in their own psychedelic work. But I also hope it will be useful to people who never take a psychedelic, because what's important is not the method, but what the method teaches us about the universe itself. And as a philosopher, that's what my interest in is, letting people see the universe as the universe showed it to me in these sessions.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks so much, Chris. Are you on social media anywhere?
I'm on Facebook, but I'm not really well grounded in social media. I'll have my website up hopefully within just a couple of months, and I'll be collecting. My talks are scattered all over the web. If you Google me, you'll come up with a whole bunch of videos and talks, but I haven't consolidated them and presented them in one place.
Cool. Well, I will make a little bit of an effort to consolidate some stuff, including links to all your books where people can buy them, and your website once it's live at jameswjesso.com under the page that has the show notes to this episode. Christopher, thank you very much for being on the show today.
James, my pleasure. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate your probing questions. Really excellent.
And cut. Well, thank you very much for tuning in to that episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked it, please give it a share on social media. Additionally, if you are enjoying the show and the larger body of content that you access through the Adventures Through the Mind gateway, please consider becoming a financial supporter of the show by becoming my patron on Patreon or by leaving a one-time PayPal or cryptocurrency donation. Links to doing so are contained in the description to this episode on YouTube at jameswjesso.com or in what the description I'm getting a bit lost. In whatever podcatcher you might be listening to this on. Okay, great. So that finalizes us up. Please follow me on social media at jameswjesso, and I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Take care.